Europe conquered Africa mostly, and people were so different and not as advanced as the European settlers that the Europeans felt like it was their job to show the barbarians the right way to live. They tried to Europeanize them. The progression of coercive labor was Amerindians to African slaves to indentured servants. All of these people went out of use due to one reason or another. The Amerindians died out because they had no immunity to the old world diseases such as smallpox, which killed the most of them. The use of African slaves was abolished due to the horrible mistreatment of them, and indentured servants were used for a time because there were simply no other choices of people. The first two were treated extremely poorly, largely due to the fact that they were different from the conquering people. Indentured servants came from the mother country and therefore demanded more respect and better living conditions than the native people. Also, they had to work for the time they signed up for only. The slaves usually worked for their masters until they died. During this time is when we really see who will come to power and stay in power. Europe was the first to industrialize and also the first to take over new lands. They reaped the rewards from these new lands, which in turn put more money in their pockets and allowed them to keep ahead of the competition by investing in even more new technology. China, however, was left behind. They refused to embrace the European technologies and couldn't industrialize like the rest of the world. The Ottoman Empire also died out because they couldn't replace their cavalry with more heavy firepower. Russia attempted to westernize, starting with Peter the Great. However, the Tsars that followed him reversed all he had tried to work towards. The government eventually took over all aspects of the economy and kept the people illiterate. In the long run, this was a terrible decision, as today's Russia isn't nearly as industrialized as the rest of the world. The West left business up to the people, which allowed them to become more richer. The people were also encouraged to learn to read and write. Russia never was on very good standings with the West, and there were too many differences, such as religion. Russia was Eastern Orthodox, and the rest of the world was Catholic or Protestant. India was under British rule at the time. It had access to the things the British gave them. However, this imperialism really only benefited the British. They were able to sell their finished factory manufactured goods for a great profit. On the other hand, India was shipping raw goods out to the factories and receiving little payment in return. It was a cycle of dependency, one of which they couldn't get out of.
Neo-Confucianism is a form of Confucianism that was developed during the Sung Dynasty. It was a philosophy that attempted to merge certain basic elements of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist thought. Neo-Confucian writings adapted Buddhist thoughts and beliefs to the Confucian interest. European exploration led to a lot of discoveries and accomplishments. The New World was discovered, and Europeans were able to expand into it. The triangular trade system was created. New navigational technologies were developed, like lateen sails, the astrolabe, three-masted caravels, and the magnetic compass. Most of the newly powerful European states, including Spain and France, developed into absolute monarchies or governments in which the king held all power. They built a large bureaucracy that was staffed with commoners loyal to the king. Cardinal Richelieu first introduced this during the reign of Louis XIV. Not only had people's lives previously revolved around religion, but the church had actively defined many other aspects of society, including politics, arts, and science. During the era from 1450 to 1750, the church lost significant power in almost every way. The Protestant Reformation, a movement led by Martin Luther, a German priest who believed that the church was seriously flawed, seriously weakened the church's religious authority. The Ottoman Empire was made up of a collection of Turkish tribes from Asia Minor. In 1453, they conquered Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire. Using an extensive civil service and bureaucracy, they maintained a large, multi-ethnic empire for 600 years. There was a strong demand for slaves and a guaranteed profit for anyone in the market. European middlemen profited the most from the transatlantic slave trade. The demand for sugar and tobacco in Europe and the demand for more slaves in the Caribbean secured a return on their investment. Around 15 to 25 million slaves were transported to America through the Atlantic trade system. The development of the plantation system and choice of growing a single cash crop on the plantation gave rise to the Atlantic slave trade. Harem refers to the sphere of women in a usually polygamous household and their quarters, which were enclosed from the rest of the world. It originated in the Near East and came to the Western world via the Ottoman Empire. The purpose of harems during the Ottoman Empire was for the royal upbringing of the future wives of noble and royal men. No forms of sexual activity took place in harems. When the Portuguese first came in 1482, the two societies of Portugal and Congo became linked and stayed that way for many years. The Kingdom of Congo created a centralized rule with officials overseeing military, judicial, and financial matters. They formed a strong alliance with Portugal that would last for many years. In an effort to reestablish order in its international relations, the Tokugawa shogunate prohibited trade with Western nations, prohibited the Japanese from going abroad to trade, effectively ending the unofficial piracy and trade on the Chinese coast. Japan was effectively isolated from Europe for 200 years. The Dutch got to keep Nagasaki, and books were translated to Japanese. This is how Japan kept up to date on the global workings and technology.
While the monarchs from both Asia and Europe based their leadership on religion, they conveyed it differently. In France and England, the monarchs were slowly trying to expand their power with a system of absolute monarchy by removing the Estates General in France and minimizing the role of the medieval parliament in England. In China, under the Ming Dynasty, the emperor, strongly influenced by Neo-Confucianism, formed a strong government. The main empires in this period were the Russian, the Ming, and the Ottoman. The Ottoman was an economic-based empire located in the Islamic world. Their main source of power came from being located at the crossroad between Asia and Europe. The power of the Russian Empire was based on size, and its main focus was expansion. The Ming Empire, however, was not focusing on expansion and trade. Its main emphasis was the cultural reawakening to reinstate Chinese traditions. The Chinese economic system was a version of the European one. While business in Europe showed signs of early capitalism, called mercantilism, the Chinese were establishing a proto-capitalism. Japan and China had a similar attitude towards the European explorers and their influence. Overall, they were sealed off from the Europeans except for one connection each: the Dutch for the Japanese and the Jesuits for the Chinese. The Chinese used the Jesuit missionaries to gain access to European technology. In the end, both profited the same from the Europeans opening up to Western ideas in the more technical field than the cultural one. Slavery and serfdom were two of the prevailing forms of labor at this time. While slavery meant the person was property, serfdom meant the worker was owned by the land or in debt to the lord owning the land, and had more opportunity to leave. Trade in Mughal India was very open, especially towards the Europeans. This was because the Mughal saw the Europeans as trade partners. The Chinese didn't view the Europeans as trade partners as much as the Mughal did. They were instead fairly closed and only connected and traded with the Christian missionaries to easily gain access to the European technologies. The relation Europeans had with Russia was mainly cultural, and the relation the Ottomans had was mainly economical. Under Peter I and Catherine the Great, Russia tried to Europeanize themselves culturally. Due to their religious beliefs, the Chinese viewed the family as a microcosm of the state. Just like the emperor ruling over the state with a mandate of heaven, the father was considered to possess a natural authority, which made him the leader of the family, and which gave men superiority in any social context. The place for women was in the home, where they were responsible for the upbringing and education of the children. However, in Europe, women had to be good Christians and obey their husbands regardless of their status. Men were considered to be superior to women every way. Women also had the right to inheritance, to own property, and conduct a business. The trade in both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans was mainly under European control. In the Americas, the Europeans had colonized the land and had a monopoly over the economy. This led to the creation of a system now called triangular trade. That gave the mother countries a lot of power and dominance over the colonies. The European control in the Indian Ocean was mainly done from the ports they established. During this period, the technological advancements belonged mainly to the Europeans. The Ottoman Empire had one of the best militaries in the world with the use of cannons and muskets, but these technologies were initially invented and first used by the Europeans. The Ming Empire was behind in technology too. Most of the technological progress made during the Ming Dynasty was achieved due to European contact.
The establishment of churches and monasteries brought about the development of a form of stone architecture loosely based on Roman forms. This style was later named Romanesque. The characteristics were massive stone walls, openings topped by semicircular arches, small windows, and, particularly in France, arched stone vaults and arrows. In the decorative arts, Celtic and Germanic barbarian forms were absorbed into Christian art. One of the distinguishing features of Renaissance art was its development of highly realistic linear perspective. Renaissance architecture emulated and improved on classic forms. Overall, in the Middle Ages, art was flat, unreal, and religious. During the Renaissance, art became more real, three-dimensional, and more secular. During this time, people were starting to think independently. This led to a general increase in intelligence, which led to a better society. Religion wasn't running people's thoughts and minds. They began to have their own brains and to think independently.